Today, we're going to talk about pesticides and kind of the integrated pest management, beginning of a lot of that being kind of spread across what we talk about. So when I refer to IPM, you'll know that that is integrated pest management. And this is kind of the first piece of a lot of that we'll be talking about throughout the training. So first of all, pesticide safety. We're going to really focus on pesticide safety for consumers within your landscape. And this all comes from what we call the PSEP office. So the Pesticide Safety Education Program that's still located within the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture on East Campus. They work with the Department of Ag, and they pretty much put all of the education pieces together for a lot of the pesticide training that happens across the state. So what we're going to look at today are what are pests, what are pesticides, pesticide labeling, risks and poisonings of pesticides, protecting people and pets and plants, and the environmental protections of that. So really, I want you to kind of put all this together, understand what IPM is, and how we use chemicals as kind of that last resort in IPM usually, and really think first and then spray last. So first of all, a definition is what is a pest. So a pest is really anything, and a pest to me may not be a pest to you, but it it's really what we look at as harming livestock, the plants, people, usually something that's a nuisance. So lots of people consider snakes as pests. As you can see here in this picture, Dennis Farrow does not consider snakes as pests. And I do not like snakes. I would not have them in my house. They can stay out of my house, but I do know that they are good for my garden and they are good for my landscape because they do eat other critters that will harm my plants considerably more than these snakes scaring me. So another pest that is a pest sometimes and a good guy other times is some things that are sometimes introduced. This is a picture of the multicolored Asian lady beetle. Most of you have probably seen this at one time or another. Don't really see them a lot until fall. These are actually a beneficial insect. They eat lots of whiteflies, aphids mainly, but really eat those bad guys that we really don't want on our plants. But in the fall, what their kind of main goal is to survive and be warm. So oftentimes we find them sneaking into our house through small crevices and stuff. And then they become a pest. So throughout the gardening season, they're a good guy. In the fall, they usually become bad guys. There's been records of them in the fall swarming up to over 100,000 per swarm, but really these are very easy to take care of. They usually are best just vacuuming them up. You don't need to spray them. However, they do emit a foul odor if you do smush them. So vacuuming them sometimes is a little bit better. And if you do want to kind of pick them up and take them outside, that kind of sometimes causes a problem because they can bite and their bites do hurt, actually kind of bad. So again, a pest is whatever you consider a pest. So these are not a pest to me. I know how to take care of them. If I find them in the house, then, I just vacuum them up and call it good. So next we're going to look at some rules and regulations and kind of where all of those come from when we're talking about pesticides. And pesticides include everything from insecticides, fungicides, rodenticides. So all of those are considered a pesticide. So it originally acted, Congress started the FIFRA Act in 1947, and that was to protect people and the environment by providing for controlled use of certain pesticides. That law encompassed pesticide registration, classification, labeling, and distribution, use, disposal of those pesticides. So then in 1993, Nebraska Department of Ag actually began administering the Pesticide Act, and they actually now issue applicators licenses or certificates for restricted use pesticides. And then what PSEP does is they actually provide the education and training for that particular certification. So, like I said, pesticide is an overall arching name for multiple different groups of pesticide, insecticide, fungicide, those kinds of things. And most of them all do and control pests different ways, whether it be physical, chemical, biological, interfering with their metabolism or their normal behavior. And really what they all do is their goal is to kill. So the suffix "side" means to kill. So whichever one they are, that's really their main goal. And they do it in multiple different ways. So there's lots of different pesticides, and lots of things can be pesticides. Bleaches, Lysol, pine oil, those are all different kinds of pesticides. Paints, stains, duct cleaners, botanicals. So one of the ones that we often hear about, especially dealing with insecticides, is neem oil. So neem oil is actually down within the botanicals. It's actually a fruit, the seed, and from a neem tree, which is an evergreen that is kind of subtropical, so down by the Indian subcontinent. It's commercially available and used, like I said, for organic farming. And then there's also another one that people consider for organic, and that's vinegar. Well, the vinegar, you just kind of have to understand some of these things. The vinegar that you pull off the shelf, that you make your vinaigrettes out of or pickle your pickles with, is not the vinegar that's going to be able to be a herbicide or to kill your weeds. So it's just not strong enough. It's not gonna do it. It's kind of gonna burn the top of it, but still not kill that root, which is really the main goal of trying to get rid of that plant. So you really need to get acidic acid in vinegar, which is the concentrated level, and it needs to be, at least 11% or more. Most of those ones that are on our shelf are 1 or 2 or 3% at most. And once you get up into that 11%, it can cause burns and permanent injury if it's not handled correctly. So here's just a picture of kind of just showing all the different pesticides by which pest is controlled. So like I said, fungicides, pesticides, molluscides, insecticides, herbicides, etc. So one of the things that's really important is understanding also how pesticides work. So often we're hearing people say that there are certain weeds for herbicides that are herbicide resistant. Well, normally that means that it's resistant to that mode of action. And understanding what those modes of actions are very important, because if you see that something's not working, if you continually use the exact same mode of action, then the biology of that plant or insect could potentially kind of change, and it will actually become then resistant to that particular mode of action. So understanding what the mode of action is important, and then being able to change that up so you don't get that resistance is important. So most fungicides, I'm going to tell you, are preventative. So if you know that you get a specific disease most of the time, then you're usually wanting to put them on before that disease starts. There are very, very few curative fungicides. So it's kind of that you need to, if you know that it is, you need to pre-plan for those fungicides. Or there's a lot, when we talk when we talk about rots and spots, we'll talk about kind of the 3 triggers and kind of management process to get rid of that. But just remember, when you're applying something, most fungicides are going to be a preventative. So then there's herbicides. So there's non-selective pesticides and selective pesticides. Non-selective pesticides are ones that are going to get rid of everything. It doesn't make any difference whether it is a monocot or a dicot. So remember when we talked about those under the angiosperms, it's just gonna kill everything. Selective pesticides are ones that will only get rid of a certain, whether it be a dicot or a monocot. So if you have turf and you want to get rid of, which is a monocot, and you want to get rid of your broadleaf weeds, which are dicots, then you're going to spray something that does not affect the turf, but affects the broadleaf weeds. So that's going to be a selective pesticide. Then there's 2 kind of types, whether it be contact, so you spray on it, it goes on the leaves, and then it goes through that cuticle layer of the leaf down into the plant. Or there's ones kind of like what we consider like a drench, where you're going to spray it. It's going to go into the soil, into the roots, and then up through the plant for then that plant to take that up and then kill it. Then there are insecticides. So now we're talking about all the bugs. So contact systemic, going to be the same as for the plants. And then these are all going to act on a lot of different ways to or parts of that insect. So nervous system, digestive system, its metabolism. There are specific growth regulators. And then there's ones that kind of go over the top. So they're more of a contact and they're going to suffocate it. So those are the oils or the desiccants for soaps. So lots of different things to think about. And just remember that we kind of always want to be changing these modes up so that those insects that you have or weeds that you have don't become resistant. So it's really important knowing what's that mode of action. So pesticide laws and regulations, the label is the law, not just a catchy saying. This is real. It is a violation of federal law to actually use that chemical and the product that is not consistent with its labeling, and you can be fined if you are caught doing that. So just know what it is, read it carefully, and make sure that you do understand that these are regulated and approved by both the US EPA and the Department of Ag. So make sure that you read the labels. It should be done before you buy it, before you mix it, before you apply it, when you store it, and how you dispose of it. So everything that you need to know about that product as you buy it, to the time that you use it, to the time that you are done with it and need to dispose of it, will be explained explicitly in that label. Then there's safety data sheets. Normally we see these a lot more in commercial areas, but you can sure have these. Most of your chemicals are going to be stored outside, so the label will be with that container outside in a shed or somewhere that's probably not as convenient with you, especially, you know, in the winter and stuff. So getting these, you can download these off the internet. These are the safety data sheets. OSHA requires these to be on hand in most commercial settings, but having these, you know, kind of in your gardening journal, kind of tucked away so that you can refer back to them when you need to, just as a reminder for, you know, oh, I don't remember what kind of protection I need when I apply X. So this is really great to have on hand. So here is kind of what the certified pesticide applicator's license looks like. Now remember, the Nebraska Department of Ag is responsible for certifying and licensing people if you want to use restricted use chemicals. And then PSEP, who works within the Department of Agronomy and Horticulture, creates the educational material that helps you get that certificate. And remember that homeowners are just as liable for misuse of pesticides on their property as if you had a commercial license and you are, you know, spraying in someone else's yard too. So remember, follow that label at all times. And then pesticides are labeled as general use or restricted use. So general use ones are those ones that you normally find in all the box stores or your nurseries that you can just go in and purchase. The restricted use ones are ones that you're going to find in more of the like farm stores, co-ops, those kinds of things, where you're actually going to need that license in order to purchase it. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit that you can seem to get more and more of these restricted use chemicals online, and they aren't really seeming to check whether or not you have these. So please make sure that you kind of read whatever you're buying, especially if you're buying online, as to what it is and whether it's actually a restricted use pesticide or not. So here's just a couple labels to show you a general use and a restricted use. One thing that I'm going to tell you is that the labels are all going to have what we consider signal words. So they're either going to be caution and warning or danger. And all of them are going to say keep out of reach of children. So a lot of times we talk about natural and organic, and however you want to manage your landscape, that's perfectly fine. But I want people to understand, and sometimes this gets a little bit confusing, is that just because you say you're doing organic or natural, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's safe when it comes to application of pesticides. There are organic pesticides that actually are much more harmful to yourself, you as the human, than as to the actual thing that you're putting it on, whether it's a fungicide or an insecticide or a herbicide. And then those natural ones are also not necessarily always safe. And then synthetic ones, where people kind of are trying to stay away from them, sometimes those aren't as toxic to you as the human as some of those organic and natural ones. So it's always a decision, and that is completely your decision. But I just want to kind of give everybody all the facts so that they do understand what these words mean, and really then make an informed decision on how they move forward. So here's just a simple quote. All substances are poisonous. There is none that is not a poison. It's just the dose, the right dose difference of poison from the remedy. So labels help us manage the risk, and the labels are going to tell us toxicity is how dangerous that pesticide is, and whether it affects our acute or immediate or long-term. And then the exposure is going to tell us how the pesticides might get into our bodies, whether it's skin or eye, inhalation or ingestion. So again, those labels, very important, are going to be able to tell us that toxicity and that exposure. And then that gives us then what the risk is to ourselves. And most of the time it's going to be whether it's going to show, like it says here, through your skin, through your eyes, or through your mouth. So toxicity is the measure of the pesticide capacity to cause injury, dependent on the chemical properties and the concentration of that particular chemical. And then the exposure occurs when the pesticides get into the body through the various routes: skin, eyes, mouth. So what are the risks? There's acute risks, and those are always going to show up usually less than 24-ish hours: rash, nausea, eye tics, stomach cramps, those kinds of things. And then there's the chronic. Those are usually the ones that are most important, and those are the ones you see in the news all the time: cancer, birth defects, allergies, organ damage. There's an ag health study that's been tied to Parkinson's using paraquat and rotentin. The wearing gloves was the key to protecting yourself. So those people using those years ago, the personal protective equipment, PPE, people really weren't using those like they should be. And sometimes that has led to some of those chronic issues. But again, that label is going to tell you exactly what that PPE is that you need to wear. So here's that study. Here's kind of some of the things that came out of it. What the how the ag lifestyle and the generic factors affected life for the farming. The study of health outcomes of the licensed pesticide applicators and spouses of Iowa and North Carolina. And then there were 89,000 farmers and spouses that were involved in this. And multiple organizations worked with this. So National Cancer Institute, Environmental Protection Agency, National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health. So all of these groups work together. And they use generic information from chicken cells and collected the mouth, and then they combined with exposure information from questionnaires to get a more complete picture of how the exposures were associated with risks of developing specific health conditions. So some of the findings that they found were that gloves matter for reducing exposure, that the diabetes and thyroid risk increased with the chemicals, but a lot of them decreased if they were wearing the correct PPE. So you can read some of these other findings. But really the final point is using the correct PPE reduced exposure and handling. When you were not handling them correctly, that increased the risk. So good handling practices reduced exposure, and good cleanup practices reduced risk to your family. So what is good cleanup, or what is your PPE first? That is headgear, eyewear, respirator, coveralls or an apron, gloves, boots. That label is going to be tell you exactly what you need to wear when you're applying. And then if the label doesn't tell you, the minimum that you should be wearing are long pants, long sleeves, shoes, socks, and gloves. So if the label doesn't specifically spell out exactly what your PP is, remember long pants, long sleeves, shoes, socks, and gloves. Cover your skin as much as possible. So when you are done spraying and you have completed, we found that removing all the clothing as soon as possible is important. Take your shoes off, leave them at the door, don't bring them in the house. Wash your clothes separately from the rest of the family laundry and wash it on the hottest setting as possible. Run the washing machine on empty after you do your laundry if you've been out spraying or applying any kind of pesticides. And then if possible, line dry your clothing so the dryer doesn't get contaminated, and sunlight actually helps break down any of those extra residues that may not have gotten out of your clothing during the wash cycle. So now we're going to switch to toxicity. So toxicity is measured through what we call LD50. LD50 is lethal dose 50, and that is what dose will kill 50% of that sample population. And rats are usually always used to test this LD50, and it's always given in milligrams per kilogram. So it's milligrams of the substance per the kilogram of what your body weight is. And then it's going to tell the acute exposure of oral, dermal, and respiratory. So just as a reference, here's just kind of how this all breaks down for milligram per kilogram. And a shot glass is 1 ounce. So this is going to look at what it takes to get an acute application. So we have 2 different chemicals. So we have boric acid, and then we have rotentin. So here is the boric acid. The LDL is less than 10,000 milligrams per kilogram. So it has a higher dose, and it would be less toxic for somebody who is 140 pounds. So you would need 22.2 ounces of boric acid to get a lethal dose. The other one, the rotentin, is one where you would only need 3.3 ounces or 0.3 to 3.3 ounces for a lethal dose. So it is much more toxic. So the LDL shows as 132 to 1500 milligrams per kilogram. So you can go in and see kind of what those LDLs, and the bigger the number, the less toxic it's going to be. Smaller the number, the more toxic it's going to be. So you're going to need a lower dose to kill 50% of what your group number is. So there's going to be 3 signal words that are always on your labels, and that's going to relate back to what those LD50s are. So caution is going to be above 1,000 milligrams per kilogram. Warning is going to be in that threshold of 50 to 1,000, and then danger is going to be less than 50. So those signal words are indicate the potential of toxicity to that user, not to the pest. So it's always going to affect the pest. This is what it is to you as the person applying that chemical. So there's lots of relative toxicity, and like we had said earlier, everything is going to kill you. It's just in a matter of dosage as to what it would be. Even water, is lethal at one point or another. So here is just kind of a list and a relative toxicity list. So this is going to be the LDL. numbers, and it's going to kind of show you as you go down, and then it's going to relate back to those warning words, caution words. So we're going to look at the first couple things. So sugar and the alcohol. So this is sugar that you would cook with and the alcohol that you would drink. Those are your LDLs. Eventually those would could kill you. But so the range is from least toxic, like I said, the range least toxic to most toxic. In the case of these chemicals, their relative toxicities compared to a standard manner on the oral LD50 in those test rats. It's the dose of the chemical that's required to kill 50% of rats in a specific amount of time. Table sugar and ethyl alcohol and aspirin are toxic depending on the amount of dose you receive. So as you can see, depending on what the dose is, it could potentially kill you. Some common pesticides, such as glyphosate, malathion, rhodamil, temic, are used. On the right side of this table is the EPA signal words. So the signal words that we just talked about, which correspond to the level of toxicity for that chemical. So the signal words are caution, warning, and danger. Remember, it was the 1,000, 50 to 1,000, and less than 50. The EPA mandates that these signal words are clearly printed on that pesticide label. Again, the most dangerous chemical has the lowest LDL. So the lower that is, the more dangerous that chemical would be. So the EPA also requires those signal words, but they also do add sometimes symbols. So you can see these symbols that relate back to those caution words. And these are just ones that will help you kind of understand and remember which is the least to the most severe. Signal words are indicators for acute toxicity of exposure to the user, not the pest. It's based on dermal, respiratory, and oral toxicity, just as a reminder. So what are some of the symptoms? Here are a whole list. And the longer chronic effects are the ones that are further to the right of this image. So knowing just kind of in your head, remembering what some of these symptoms are, that's really what we just kind of want you to remember. So just know what the exposure risks are and take those steps to minimize those risks. Remember, in that study, they showed that if you were actually using the correct PPE, that limited any of those exposure problems that those people in that study had. So protecting non-targets. So now we're going to kind of talk about going outside. If you are spraying, what's going to happen to non-targets. So make sure that you leave a buffer zone around. So if you are spraying somewhere, stay away from more sensitive areas. Make sure that you understand wind speed, time of day, temperature, all those kinds of things. Root uptake. Remember, some of those were systemic. So if you put them in the ground, are there other roots that will help take them up? Be careful of pollinators. Make sure that you're protecting your waterways, fish, livestock, wildlife, all those kinds of things. On that label, it's going to tell you if there is a restricted entry time. So that is an REI, so restricted entry interval. Those restricted entry intervals mean that there is a specific time after that application is applied that you can go back into that area. Sometimes it's 12 hours. It can be sometimes 24, depending on what pesticides you're using and depending on what crop you're using it on. So just remember that pets walk sometimes on those newly treated areas, and they are walking with that dermal exposed, and then they'll lick it. So make sure that you accommodate if you do have pests or pets, not pests, to make sure that you have that REI and know what time that reentry time is for those pets. So there's also other things to remember when you're applying it. Don't apply where that is going to be spread on a more porous surface that could actually be then gone down into the drains. Those drains always lead out to rivers. So then you're, could potentially be exposing fish or other wildlife. There's also the insects that you need to be aware of. So make sure that you know what time of day you're doing it, what time those pollinators are moving around, and those kinds of things. Protecting the environment's just very important. So pesticides are going to move in a couple different ways. We've kind of looked at a couple of them so far. So drift, that's going to be airborne, where they're going to get up into the air currents and then move outside that treatment area. If you overspray, if you're kind of spraying and it gets off where your target area is and then run off. So like I said, if it gets on a porous surface and it rains or you water, your irrigation system goes off, and then it then goes down into that drainage system and then out into the rivers or streams. So drift, overspray, runoff, it's going to waste your resources, and then it does create legal issues because like I said, that's part of that label and it's telling you not to do that. Some pesticides can be phototoxic and damage sensitive crops, i.e. tomatoes and grapes. That usually seems to be the two that we get most complaints about. It can also cause complications for organic farmers. Organic farmers need to stay organic, and if you are spraying a non-organic pesticide, that could result in some issues with their organic status. Contributes to the issues of pesticide resistance. So like I said, when we were talking about the modes of activity of where those insect or pesticides work, if you continually spray or your neighbors continually spraying the same thing, then that can potentially be a problem. So we want to make sure that pesticides don't go into the water. USGS reports finding glyphosate and other herbicides in many Midwestern streams. So that's going to be from your runoff. California study find that pyrethroids were in the surface water. So glyphosate is a herbicide and the pyrethroid is an insecticide. So storm water is the water from the rain or melting snow that runs off the surface. Really what we're doing is that overspray or overuse onto those porous surfaces, hard surfaces, and then that rain or snow melt or irrigation then moves that off of your area into the stormwater system, and then it starts contaminating the rivers and the lakes and those kinds of things. So 2013, the EPA created an initiative to minimize the pyrethroid movement into such sensitive sites. So the goal was to make sure that they were not moving, to minimize the ecological exposure to what these were. Then that applicators must pay attention to the weather, sprinkler schedules, avoid runoff, those kinds of things. So pretty much what we've been talking about this whole time. So, and then they actually then went ahead and changed the labels on a lot of the pyrethroids so that they want to make sure that sprays and granulars Stay off sidewalks and surfaces adjacent, especially adjacent to sewer drains. But just remember, all of your sidewalks eventually end up in a sewer drain at one point or another. So drift, that's always one that we seem to get a lot of. Pretty much all summer long, I will get calls or emails from people saying, what's wrong with my tomatoes? What's wrong with my grapes? Usually has something to do with drift. Drift occurs by both weather, wind, and temperature, and then the timing of the day. Just be aware of your neighbors, be aware of what crops they have, whether they are grapes, tomatoes, organic crops, bees, etc. 2,4-D seems to be the most one that we seem to kind of have 2,4-D damage for tomatoes and grapes. Wind direction, velocity, that's going to influence the drift. Also the spray droplets, the finer the droplet that's coming out of your sprayer is gonna catch in that air easier. So if you can make sure or know that you are using medium to coarse droplets, that's really going to help if you have if you are concerned of any drift issues. And then there is the issue of the chemical turning from a liquid to a gas. So it's going to volatilize. That's usually happens when the temperatures are too high. A lot of chemicals labels are going to tell you what temperature their maximum temperature is for application. A lot of times that's like 80 or 85 degrees. So oftentimes in the summer, I see people out in their yards, 6 o'clock at night, 20-mile-an-hour winds, and it's 95 degrees outside, and they're out spraying the cracks in their sidewalks because there's a few weeds out there and they want to get rid of them. So pretty much hitting every single one of those don't do's. And then people wonder why we have problems off-site because of drift or volatilization. So again, droplet size, wind speed, distance to target. There are more and more applicators that you can get where you can have like a cone. You can put it around the head of your sprayer to really make sure that you're getting to your target. Make sure you know what the temperature and humidity and then soil conditions are going to make sure to make that. Soil conditions are also going to influence some of this. So wet soils increases volatilization and increases the vapor drift. So just minimize drift, minimize runoff. Here's your whole list. There's actually a website that you can go in and see. This is a tool for commercial growers so that you will know what your neighbors are, especially if they're organic gardens or crops, or if you have people that have apiaries or fish that are close to you if you're out spraying, especially those that are kind of on the outskirts of town and out into the rural areas. So Drift Watch users can sign up each year so their operations shown on a specific map. There's Drift Watch, Bee Watch, and Field Watch. So you can sign up for all three if you have it. Field Watch is the kind of overall, and then you have Drift Watch for specialty crops, then Bee Watch. Here's what that map looks like. So it'll show you exactly what they are. You can go in and kind of zoom in and see and click on the little pins and see who that is, what specific crop that is, those kinds of things. So it's good information. That way you're reducing movement off pesticides, right pesticide, right amount, right time, right place, right conditions. So We often talk about right plant, right place. Using pesticides, it's also going to do right pesticide, right place, right time, all those kinds of things. So in an effort to protect pollinators, the new bee advisory box is going to appear on pesticide labels that contain imidacloprid and a few other specific chemicals, alerts applicators to specific use of restrictions, specifically for bees and other insect pollinators. It's going to encourage any applicator to minimize the exposure of bees during foraging. Remember, foraging happens during the daytime. If you do need to apply any kind of pesticides, excuse me, if you're concerned about pollinators, then you need to do that kind of later in the day after the sun goes down, because then they'll be back into their homes and done for the day. So here's just an example of the label that has information about the protecting the pollinators. Here's specifically that bee check. So we cleared out all the other pins. This is just specifically for bee checks. You can see where people have apiaries. So a great resource for you. So just a few more tips. Don't transport pesticides in the passenger space of a closed vehicle. Make sure that the passengers' pets don't ride with it, and then don't transport food with those pesticides. Make sure that you are handling them properly. And if you do happen to have a spill, make sure that you have a good containment or spill bucket set up. So you want to make sure that you have absorbent materials, a shovel, a broom, a dustpan, and then some heavy detergent. So if you do happen to have a spill, you have those right tools to clean it all up and get rid of it. So you have pesticide storage. If you've purchased it and you're using it, make sure that you put it in a separate building or storage container, if possible. If not possible, then put it in a specific place within that building. Don't ever store pesticides out of its original container. These are usually where the mishaps happen, where people mistake what is supposed to be in that bottle. Don't even think about, even if you carefully label it, just don't do it. It's just not good. Here's some stories on paraquat poisoning. Just not a good thing. Always keep it in the original bottle. Just don't share it. Buy new. Hand that complete bottle over to your neighbor if you're gonna kind of share it with someone. So nope, just don't do it. Secure against theft, vandalism, post warning signs, those kinds of things if you're going to store area outside. And then make sure that you dispose of those containers when you're done the correct way. Again, it's going to tell you on the label how to do it. Sometimes it's going to tell you to rinse it and then apply whatever that rinsed water is to the site that pesticide is labeled for. It's just so long as you're not exceeding the label rate. Sometimes the option is to use a carrier of the same product for the next batch. Sometimes disposing of unused pesticides consists of having to take it to a hazardous waste disposal company. That's usually going to cost you some money. In Lincoln and Lancaster County, there are usually collection sites for these. They are usually spread across the city, usually in March, April, May, June, and September. So kind of keep an eye on that. If you can, rinse it. Make sure that you puncture that bottle before you send it off to the landfill, because you don't want anybody else using that bottle for something else. In case there is any little bit of residue, puncture it, send it off to the landfill if possible, and then that way no one else is tempted to use it.